Let me s- please. Hello, my name is Heidi Matonis. I am a member of Greenwich Pen Women, which is the local chapter of the National League of American Pen Women, an organization supporting professional women in the arts. Tonight, in partnership with the Perrot Library, we are honored to introduce Liza Mundy, an award-winning journalist and the New York Times best-selling author of 5 books, including her latest, The Sisterhood, The Secret History of Women at the CIA. Many of you might also know her from The Code Girls, the untold story of American women code breakers of World War II, which was the Greenwich Reads Together selection of 2018. Now, it's my honor to introduce Liza. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. by the miracle of digital technology, which we've all gotten used to in the past couple of years. And I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person, but it's great to have the option to get together this way. And I look forward to talking to you about my most recent book. And I realize there's nothing more exciting, particularly in the evening after a long day, than a good PowerPoint presentation. But I can assure you that these are images, a lot of them are images that I came across during the course of my research, and hopefully it will make for a lively time. And I am so we all know, I'm sure, what a spy looks like, or what our idea of a modern spy is. He's a white guy. His appearance has changed really quite little over the decades. He's brunette often. He wears a tuxedo. He drinks alcohol, and he carries a firearm often. And he spends a lot of time in casinos and on ski slopes, fighting evil, getting information, and keeping the world safe, and living this covert life and this covert identity. And that's the image of a spy, I think, that many of us have absorbed from popular culture over the decades. And accordingly, I think we all have an idea of what women in spycraft look like. And women are Miss Moneypenny often, either in her early post-war incarnation, or more recently in a modern incarnation. This is the British actress Naomi Harris, who plays Miss Moneypenny in Skyfall. And she's a more modern Moneypenny in the sense that she is out in the field sometimes, like James, using a firearm and taking place in operations. But actually, by the end of that movie, she's decided that field work is not for everybody, and she's going to work behind a desk doing the traditional duties that Moneypenny does, which is to say she basically keeps James Bond organized. She flirts with him. She sits on his lap. She has a crush on him. But she mostly is a support person who gives him assignments, sets up meetings, communicates with him and headquarters, and serves in this support role. And so, again, I think for decades, this has been our idea of what the role that women play in intelligence gathering operations. So based on this sort of ingrained idea that we have about the role of the sexes in spycraft, I would invite you to look at this photo of an actual debutante ball that was taking place in Brussels, Belgium in 1966. The entire diplomatic community in Brussels at that time was invited to the diplomatic ball. All of the embassies sent young people as emissaries. So there were young people from all over the world. The CIA was on the lookout, as it often was, for a bright young recruit. And so the CIA was secretly recruiting a member of this crowd, a young person who was incredibly well suited for life undercover as an espionage agent. This person being recruited was a recent graduate of Brown University, had grown up all over the world, spoke French, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, had lived in different countries, very familiar with both official Washington diplomatic culture as well as undercover clandestine operations and what they were like. And so the CIA was very interested in this person. And so just based on what you've already seen and what you might have absorbed, you might think, well, maybe it's this guy. I mean, he has that sort of James Bond quality. He's wearing the traditional tuxedo. He's got a woman on his arm, as James Bond generally does. So maybe it's him. Or maybe it's this guy. He's sort of more discreetly off in the shadows, but again, sort of fits the visual model that we all have. But in fact, the person who was being avidly recruited by the CIA in 1966 at this ball was a young woman named Lisa Manful. And the reason that she was being recruited, not only by the CIA, but by the State Department as well, was because she was so well qualified for overseas diplomatic or clandestine spy gathering missions. She was the daughter of an American diplomat named Melvin Manful, who had spent 6 years when she was a young girl in Paris. So he was implementing the Marshall Plan after the war, helping to rebuild Europe. And so Lisa went to Paris when she was 6 years old, and she spent her formative years really on the streets of Paris and in Parisian schools. So as a result, she spoke French actually better than she spoke English. She was very used to diplomatic parties. She was not at all intimidated by sort of glittering crowds of people. And she was also very self-reliant, having moved around the streets of Paris as a child. A fairly lonely childhood, actually. Her parents would trot her out at diplomatic events to sort of, represent the United States and to speak immaculate French. Her parents had raised her, at a time in France when America was looked at as the great liberator of Europe. Her parents would say to her, wherever you go, you're representing the United States, you're representing America and what it stands for. So you have to be brave. If you fall down, you mustn't cry. So she had been raised with a real sense of duty and mission, all of which made her perfect for government service. And because she knew what spies did, and because she loved being out on a street and melting into crowds, she accepted a job offer by the CIA and to enter into the clandestine service and train to become an overseas intelligence officer. And the reason why, even in the 1960s, the CIA, contrary to what you might see in James Bond movies, the reason why the CIA was interested in a woman like Lisa Harper goes back to World War II. It goes back to the great and terrible surprise of the Pearl Harbor attack, when our country realized for the first time how serious the deficit of our intelligence gathering operation was. It's hard for people to believe in a day and time now when there are 18 intelligence agencies in Washington, D.C., where I am. Back when we were surprised at Pearl Harbor, there were basically zero. We didn't have a CIA. We didn't have an NSA. We didn't have any ability to listen to enemy communications or to gather intelligence about the enemy's intentions. And this had just been exposed for all the world to see with the attack at Pearl Harbor. So it was this, World War II was this awful, terrible, tragic moment when the United States enters the war. All of a sudden, all the young men are shipping out to fight. They're fanning out all over the world into harm's way. at the very moment when we need to really scale up our intelligence gathering and begin to build both a code breaking operation and a spy service. So since the young men are suddenly unavailable who would have been recruited to do this kind of work, it was this moment when, for the first time in American history, there was competition for women. There was competition for women to come to Washington. You can see this is an Army recruiting poster, but the CIA was also recruiting women very avidly. And our forerunner of the CIA was created during World War II. It was called the Office of Strategic Services. It was America's first attempt to build really a civilian spy agency run by a man named Bill Donovan, known as Wild Bill Donovan. He was a war hero from World War I. He was now too old for the fighting, but he was a bored Wall Street lawyer who wanted to serve the war effort, and Roosevelt put him in charge of building a spy service. And one of the things about World War II was that as all these different agencies are being created, the ability to become a spy. I mean, the government had to learn how to assess personalities of people, not just in terms of their skill sets or the college they went to or how much education they had, but really do sort of personality testing to see who had the wherewithal to live a covert clandestine identity, to travel overseas, to work with, say, local resistance groups in occupied France, to live a dangerous lifestyle. But also, it could be, they could be in Asia, they could be in France, they could be in occupied Norway, they could be in North Africa, gathering information and running operations as well. And so how do you test at a time when America didn't have a spy service, had not and very little was known about many of the countries that spies would be traveling to, as well as the conditions in which they would operate. How do you assess somebody's potential? I mean, we have all sorts of personality tests now and aptitude tests, but nothing like that existed. So when I was doing the research for my book, one of the interesting pieces of records that is available is called Assessment of Men. And this is a 500-page report by the panel of psychologists who were brought in to assess candidates for spy service. And as you can see, it's called Assessment of Men. And the way in which male recruits were tested for the OSS was that they were gathered together in training camps in the Virginia countryside, and they were given these imaginary roles and imaginary assignments. They had to create a cover identity for themselves. They couldn't tell anybody what their real name was or what their real background was. And then they would be assigned tasks like a group of, say, 10 men would be positioned in front of a running stream. And the test was, well, imagine that this is a rushing river and you're in occupied France and it's a chasm and the bridge is blown out and you've got a machine gun and you've got to transport it across the chasm. How are you going to do that? And so the men would be observed to see how well they could work together. There would be some 2x4s lying by the stream, and they were to imagine that these were tree trunks, and they would have to try to build a bridge to cross the chasm. And they would be observed to see who emerged as a leader, who proved to be trustworthy, who got easily frustrated, who didn't. And sometimes there would be people who were actually assigned to thwart the exercise because they wanted to test how well people would withstand frustration. So the whole thing was a test. They were being tested even when they didn't know they were being tested in the evenings over meals. Again, they were being observed to see who could get along well, who was liked, who was trusted as a leader, who wasn't, who could hold their liquor, not just whether they drank or not, but who could hold their liquor. So there was this rapid, sort of desperate attempt to really take the measure of a man before he was sent overseas to do spy work. And meanwhile, thousands of the recruits for the OSS were actually women. And the women were very unusual for the time. At a time in American life when only 4% of American women had a 4-year college education, this group of women who were either being quietly recruited or who were quietly applying to join the OSS, 50% of them were college graduates. Many of them had good jobs in the private sector at a time when this was very unusual for women. So it was a really elite group of women who were sort of quietly drawn into applying for this work. And the women were also assessed. But the test that they were given was they were called into a room and they were given 10 letters and they were given 3x5 cards and they were told to develop a filing system, a good filing system, so that this information could be stored and then could be easily retrieved. So they were being given secretarial and clerks work. And it was, in fact, really important. In all of these spy organizations, in all of these government organizations, there was an enormous amount of paperwork. You can see some of the women who were working for the OSS's early map making effort. So you can see how much paperwork there really was. And it really was important for it to be stored and retrieved and easily accessible. But at the same time, these women were being tested not only for their ability to develop efficient systems, which would remain extremely important for the decades after the war up until now, but they were also being tested specifically for their ability to withstand frustration, because the psychologists who were observing them and assessing them, a few of them were women, and they had already observed that in the spy service, one of the peculiar frustrations that women were going to have to put up with was was being underutilized, having their skills underestimated and underutilized, and being employed as clerks and secretaries, even if they came, say, from a high-level job in advertising or newspaper journalism. So that is how the women got their start at the OSS, which would eventually become the CIA. And just to give you a sense of the caliber of the women recruited into the OSS and the way in which it changed their lives, this is one of the more famous graduates of the Office of Strategic Services. Her name in 1942 was Julia McWilliams, and she was a graduate of Smith College, a fine institution like many of the recruits of the OSS. It was a very elite group because Bill Donovan was from a very, highborn blue blood type family. And so he liked to recruit from people with similar backgrounds. So Julia McWilliams actually applied to the Women's Army Corps. She applied to be a WAC, but she was too tall. And so she found her way into the OSS, the spy service, and she started out as Bill Donovan's clerk. But then war is often an accelerant. It accelerates things like technology and medicine, and it also accelerated the careers of people who were good. So Julia McWilliams was eventually sent to China to do intelligence work there. She met a man there, a State Department mapmaker named Paul Child. And then after the war, the women were told, well, thanks very much for your service. It's time for you to go back to your regularly scheduled lives, retire into the private sector. And so she married Paul Child and traveled with him to France, where he was posted in his career. She had a great meal in France. She had an epiphany about how good food can taste. She resolved to learn how to cook it herself, and she became known to the world as Julia Child. So one of the things that we have World War II to thank for is not only our freedom and our democracy and our way of life, but also the fact that our food tastes a lot better than it would have if Julia Child had not joined the OSS in 1942, I think it was. But it also shows how for the women who did these jobs during the war, it was an opportunity not only to serve their country and help win the war, but it was an opportunity to change their life course. And it did really change the lives of everybody who served, even those who didn't stay in the service. After the war, there was an effort, as I said, to get women to depart and to sort of for things to go back the way that they were. But not all women left the workplace. And in fact, after the war, when the OSS gave way to the CIA, a number of women stayed with the work. They wanted to devote their life to intelligence gathering, intelligence analysis, clandestine lifestyle. and keeping the president and national security community informed of developments. After the war, it was thought that the spy services and the code breaking services might get closed down, might get shuttered because the war was won. But then, of course, we immediately went into the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and intelligence and espionage became more important than ever at decades in which this was an existential contest between America and the Soviet Union, between democracy and communism, and the threat of nuclear war was ever present on Americans' mind. So the Central Intelligence Agency was created by an act of Congress in 1947. It operated out of the old OSS headquarters in downtown Washington, across from the State Department. It was a clandestine organization, so it had a sign outside that said Bureau of Naval Medicine. The foundational director of the CIA was a guy named Allen Dulles. Like many of the top officials in the CIA, he was an alumna of the OSS. He served the OSS during the war in Switzerland, where he was sending back an incredibly valued intelligence stream of information. Much of it was gathered from a member of the German Secret Service who was in Switzerland and was actually a double agent passing information to the United States. And he was being handled by an American woman who was the right-hand woman of Allen Dulles, Mary Bancroft. She left the service after the war. Allen Dulles stayed on. And the men of the OSS became a very tight and very important network at the CIA. The CIA was a very networked place. It still is. It was important to be part of a network. And the sort of the three-word descriptor that people often use for these early years was pale, Yale, and male. And not everybody was from Yale. Some people were from Harvard or Brown or whatever, Princeton. But it was a very narrow, a very elitist group of people who were running the CIA. And Dulles really embodied that. But for years and years, people really didn't know what the CIA was doing exactly. And so just to give you a sense of the three missions of the CIA, one of the mission is to send people overseas, spies overseas, to live a covert clandestine life and to persuade foreign nationals to pass secrets. Secrets that they have access to, that their government doesn't want our government to know. So these are actually very charismatic, very social people who are good at manipulating, at persuading, at befriending, at using any means really necessary to get information out of a person who has really important information. And that includes money. The CIA could pay people for information, or they could offer medical care to children, or they could offer to resettle parents, or use inducements like that to get people to spy. So I'm going to actually turn on the light because I see that as the light outside is waning, so is mine, and I'm not trying to live a clandestine life here. So that's one really important job, and that's really the fighter pilot position at the CIA. That's the most sought after position, is to be what's called a case officer overseas. It's a bland term, but it's the agency's term for spy. So after the war, the CIA realized that it did need women, but it wanted them to be Miss Moneypenny. It wanted the women at the CIA to be in desk jobs, processing this information that comes in from overseas. The other two jobs that are equally important at the CIA are to analyze the information that's coming in. So there's a whole analytic core at the CIA that takes this information, digests it, and writes very important reports that the president will see. Every day, the president gets something called the President's Daily Brief. that is a compendium of the most urgent intelligence that has come in overnight that the president really needs to see immediately. And the third job of the CIA, and the one that always gets it in trouble, is covert action to carry out the policy of the president. And so at its sort of most extreme, this would be the less glorious episodes in agency history, like attempts to assassinate foreign leaders or to reverse the outcome of a democratic election in countries where we wanted to keep the communists out of power. So Italy was a country of concern immediately after the war, and the CIA worked very hard through posters and propagandas and buying newspapers and infiltrating groups in Italy to keep the communists out of power. And certainly more extreme measures were taken in other countries as well. So that's always the most problematic aspect of the CIA's mission. And so the women who stayed on after the war were very, believers in the mission of intelligence gathering, and they were very committed to the work. But they very quickly became frustrated because even the women who had been part of the OSS during the war realized that they weren't getting the opportunities that the men were. They weren't rising through the ranks. They weren't being offered jobs as case officers. They weren't rising to the top positions like Alan Dulles, and they wanted to know why. So during my research, I came upon a series of reports that would ultimately give way to lawsuits and EEOC complaints in which the women protested being pigeonholed. There was this effort after the war to keep women in that role of processing and filing and archiving information and creating systems and just becoming really the brain of the CIA. And that was very important work, but it wasn't the work that all women wanted. I mean, there were women who very much wanted to be out on the street working as spies, and they had to encounter a lot of stereotypical thinking that would emerge with the publication of these reports. So as early as 1953, there were women who were objecting to the way that they were being treated. And so this was a report called the Petticoat Panel. That's literally what it was called, an attempt to figure out why women weren't rising as high as the men were. And during the course of gathering information, there were male officers at the CIA who had no hesitation in articulating stereotypical thinking about women and what they were capable of. So one of the ideas was that women can't run agents, that women can't recruit these foreign nationals to pass secrets. They can't make these deals. They can't be rainmakers. It was the same stereotype about women, say, in the law or in finance, that women weren't capable of bringing in what amounted to big clients, making that ask or handling them after the war as they passed information. So that is an example of what officers at the CIA freely said about women and their capabilities. Just to give you a sense of how wrong, to give you a sense of some of the guys who were running agents and running the war, running the agency after the war. You see here in the Speedo, this guy, David Whipple, is just a classic example of a CIA case officer. At this point, he's in Cambodia. He's talking to probably other CIA guys, but it was a very elite, but very eccentric and sort of larger than life group of men who were really heading up the CIA stations overseas and running agents as well. So another stereotype about women was that there were things that women were good at, and in this case, they were good at maintaining routines. So again, this money penny role was something that women thought were to be good at. So the agency realized that it needed women. And just another example of the kind of man who was actually out there doing the top jobs. This guy, Hans Jensen, just gives you a sense of, again, sort of the eccentricity of the average CIA case officer, and also the liquor cabinet behind him gives you a sense that there was a lot of alcohol that flowed in CIA stations overseas, and there was a lot of alcohol abuse and people being sort of medevaced home in order to dry out. So another. These are all quotes from various reports that were compiled over the years, that women can't work under the pressures of urgency. So this is one of the women in my book, Heidi August, who was recruited in 1968 out of the University of Colorado at Boulder. All of her male classmates were being recruited as potential case officers or potential CIA analysts. She was hired as a clerk. So she was hired at the very lowest rung, because that was very standard for women to be hired as a GS4. But this shows her in Cambodia. She was obliged to work for 10 years as a clerk. And here she is evacuating the CIA station in Cambodia, figuring out how to exfiltrate some of their assets, and ultimately getting on the last helicopter flight out of Phnom Penh as the Khmer Rouge are closing in. So Heidi demonstrated over and over again that women were very capable of working under the pressures of urgency. And Another stereotype about women was that if women did work as case officers overseas, the only people who would take them seriously would be other women in these countries, and that there was no point recruiting a female asset because women seldom have access to information of value. So the idea is there was no point trying to get a woman past secrets because women didn't know secrets. But what you see now there in the background, the woman who's falling asleep, that is Heidi August in her first job as a case officer. After 10 years as a clerk, she was allowed to do something that was very unusual, which is switch tracks and train to become a case officer. And she is shown at UN headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, where her cover job was as a third secretary with the U.S. Embassy's delegation there. She's squiring around Shirley Temple Black, who is present to make a presentation. But the reason she's so tired is because during the night and on weekends, she's doing her real job with the CIA, which was recruiting assets. And what Heidi realized, looking around these conference rooms at the UN, was that she could see all of these women clerks and women secretaries. And because she had done that work for 10 years, she knew that, in fact, these women had access to all the secrets in their offices because she had had access to those kinds of secrets. She had run the coding machine in her office. And so she told her boss that she was going to target women to become assets. And she ran a remarkably successful operation persuading a woman from another country who was disgruntled at the way she had been treated to pass secrets from her office that the CIA had been trying to get for a long time. So that's an example of how being female gave her the ability to spot an opportunity that the men were ignoring and to take advantage of this woman's unhappiness with the way she was being treated. Because one of the key reasons why people do pass secrets, which is an act of treason in their own country, is because they're pissed off about something, because they're disgruntled. And the world was full, literally full, of women in the 1980s who were disgruntled at the way that they were being treated. So a couple more photos. This is Lisa Harper, who you saw at the beginning in her debutante outfit in Brussels. This is her doing training at a place called The Farm, which is the CIA's famous undercover, although the identity is really quite well known, but it's 6 months or more of training to become an officer. This is Lisa in her disguise class. But what happened to Lisa that set her back is that although she was avidly recruited by the CIA, which promised her that she could become a case officer, once she entered into her training, they tried to channel her instead into a Miss Moneypenny type of job as a desk officer. And when she pushed back and said, no, that's not what you promised, and that's not what I want to do, they cut short her training. They sent her back to headquarters. And then when she fell in love and got married to a fellow case officer, which was pretty common marriages within this sort of closed community within the building, she was made to resign her position and follow her husband overseas basically with no career ahead of her at the CIA because she had gotten married. And whenever I tell audiences that this was routine at the CIA and at the US State Department for decades, in the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, the assumption was that if a woman wanted to be a CIA officer or a State Department officer and travel the world and go overseas, she had to remain single. And once she got married, her commitment was to her husband's career. So Lisa had to quit, having chosen the CIA over other jobs she could have had, and she followed her husband overseas. And for 10 years, she worked under what was called housewife cover as an unpaid spouse, developing her spy abilities, serving the US government, but not getting paid for what she did, not getting any credit, and not getting any career advancement. And this was absolutely the norm at the time. And people just can't believe that this was the case really not that long ago. That women were believed once they were married to serve their husbands' careers. So there was also this idea that women won't travel. And one of the people that you'll meet in the book, Shirley Sulik, was the very enthusiastic, very effective wife of an American case officer who was serving in Moscow. So she was certainly willing to travel, like Heidi, like Lisa. She was eager to travel. She loved traveling. This is Shirley in Moscow. And her husband talked to me at length about the incredible impact that she had on his career. Moscow was a place where CIA officers were constantly being surveilled. They were always being tailed by the KGB. And wives were incredibly important at helping their husbands elude surveillance, both in the car and on foot. And Shirley helped him with tradecraft. You can see that she carried a big bag, and she would drop a lipstick or drop a pen out of her bag and sort of spill some things and then sweep it up. And she could sweep up a Soviet message also that one of their assets had left them. So that gives you a sense of really how central wives were to their husbands' careers. It was very much the attitude of the US government was getting, that it was entitled to two for the price of one. So this is a way in which even wives served the intelligence gathering operation for decades and proved that housewife cover, proved that being seen as inconspicuous and unimportant and just another housewife going about your daily business was an incredible asset for women who were serving in this clandestine role overseas, either as paid operatives or as unpaid wives. So another stereotype about women was that they're more emotional and less objective. I'll just quickly introduce you to, this was a CIA analyst named Jean Vertifoy. And it was Jean Vertifoy and a team of women who identified one of the most notorious traitors in American espionage, a man named Aldrich Ames, who was a CIA officer. He was a legacy. His dad had been a CIA officer. He was a terrible womanizer, a terrible alcoholic. His misbehavior was overlooked by the Old Boys Network, but it was a team of women who knew him, who knew his wife, who were friends of his wife, but who saw that the couple had way more money than a normal government employee would be likely to have. They were decorating their home more ornately than an average US government employee could do. And they relentlessly tracked his movements and his bank accounts over the course of years to figure out that it was Aldrich Ames who was passing the identity of CIA assets who were in the KGB. So basically double agents who were employed by the KGB, but were passing information to the Americans. He had passed those names back to the KGB and they were executed. But ultimately, thanks to this very objective, unemotional hunt, he was identified as the mole who had passed this information, and he's in prison as a result. So what you've been able to see is the way in which women were able to serve the intelligence gathering, incredibly important intelligence gathering community for decades, even when they were being stereotyped and discriminated against. So to me, and you might think, well, this was a man-men world. This was what women had to contend with in other workplaces. But to me, one of the most egregious generalizations about women came from Richard Helms, who was one of the CIA directors. when these various studies and ultimately lawsuits and discrimination lawsuits were being conducted and opinions were being collected, he said, well, it's just nonsense for these gals to come in here and think the government's going to fall apart because their brains aren't going to be used to the maximum. Like, what's the big deal? We've got good people. So what if these women aren't being listened to? So what happened in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that there was a group of CIA analysts back at headquarters who had been sort of channeled and consigned or had chosen this very non-glamorous area of expertise called counterterrorism, which was not where you wanted to be during the contest with the Soviet Union. You wanted to be working on the Soviet desk. And these women started paying attention after 1991 to these fighters who had been in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet Union and who now weren't going back to their home countries. They were communicating with a financier called Osama bin Laden. And the woman you see there in the white suit, Gina Bennett, wrote the very first strategic warning about Osama bin Laden and this group of fighters he was funding and directing. And she wrote an incredibly prescient memo about the intelligence and intentions and capabilities of a group of terrorists called Al-Qaeda that the Washington establishment had a lot of trouble taking seriously. So for years and years, Gina Bennett and a group of female analysts were trying to call attention to the capabilities of Al-Qaeda and the result of their not being listened to by the national security community and the incoming Bush administration was the infamous morning of September 11th, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center here in Washington on the Pentagon, and the future that came about as a result of the attacks of 9/11 and everything that we've lived through since. So that was an example of it was an advantage often for women in the field working as spies to be underestimated, to be inconspicuous, to be taken for granted because they could move about more freely. But at home, back at headquarters in a government bureaucracy, it was a disadvantage, and it was very frustrating for the women analysts who weren't looked at, who weren't listened to, and taken seriously the way that they should have been, and who were sounding the alarm really for years before 9/11. The good news, if you could call it good news, is that after the terrible attacks of 9/11 and the aftermath of that, the lesson of inclusion, the importance of inclusion that we really should have learned after World War II, because inclusion was a big reason why the Allies won World War II, and it was forgotten, for decades. But it was relearned, reappreciated after 9/11. And so, speaking of handling psychological pressures, the hunt for Osama bin Laden that went on for years and years and that finally succeeded about a decade after 9/11 was conducted by a group that was strikingly dominated by women. And some of them were these same analysts who stayed on the beat, who honed this new technique called targeting, which was really manhunting, which was identifying where terrorists were hiding, picking them off one by one, and really thinking about, in the case of Osama bin Laden, thinking about, well, we have all of these new technologies, new softwares, all of these archives and databases that have been brought online that we have access to now, geospatial locating of human beings, identification of IP addresses. As technology got better and better, they were trying to find a man, Osama bin Laden, who didn't use technology. He didn't speak on cell phones. He didn't use computers because he knew that he could be traced that way. So the women had to think, well, okay, then how can we pinpoint where he is? Who would be communicating with him? So they had to think about relationships, who he knew, who might make a mistake. And they ultimately pinpointed the courier who was taking his messages and getting them out to the people who needed them. And this is the van of the courier as it was being followed back to the compound. And it was, again, a strikingly female group of targeters who pinpointed this as the compound where Osama bin Laden was hiding. They couldn't see him. They couldn't see inside. They couldn't be 100% sure, but they were very, very confident of their analysis. And one of the ways in which they identified how many families were in the compound, how many women and children were in the compound, so that when the Navy SEALs raided the compound in order to find and, if necessary, kill Osama bin Laden, they could protect the children and the wives and other civilians to the extent possible. One of the ways that they gauged who was living where in the compound was looking at the laundry on the line. So if that's not a sort of not to stereotype, plenty of men do laundry. But it was just an example of how they looked at the situation differently than the men might have. And so that's an example of how the lesson of inclusion was learned. And in the book, another young woman spy you'll meet is a woman named Molly Chambers, who lived a very James Bond lifestyle in Africa, and did attend diplomatic parties with a you see her handbag there was full of gadgets to vacuum up the cell phone numbers of people at the parties. And you can see her old-fashioned spy arsenal of license plates and diplomatic, a lot of passports, a lot of cash. And one of the counterterrorism missions that she was very involved in was bringing home some of the schoolgirls, the Nigerian schoolgirls who were kidnapped by the terrorist group Boko Haram. So that's an example of the sort of humanitarian mission that agents in the field engage in as well. And we don't hear about that as often as we do hear about some of the more unsavory operations. But that's an example of why the women were so gratified. A scene like this of girls being reunited with their parents is an example of the sort of unsung work that operatives in the field do. So the lessons of inclusion should have been apparent during World War II, and it took a long time for the country to relearn them. But I think we can see, what the results are now. And it was really a marvelous experience to get to talk to some of these long-serving women officers about their work and why they were so committed to it. And I think we have time for questions. So I'd like to hear anything that you'd like to ask.
Well, thank you, Liza. Okay, we have one question in the chat that says, did you have a specific favorite spy story? I know that's
Yeah,
really spoke to you, I guess.
Yeah, well, I do love the story of Molly Chambers's work in bringing home the schoolgirls, but I think my favorite operation in the book that readers, I don't want to spoil it, but when Heidi August convinces her very skeptical boss that it's worth recruiting women to pass secrets in the crowd at the UN, and she targets a particular woman who has access to the secret the CIA has wanted for a long time. That is really, I think, quite a delicious operation that she conceives of and executes. And that's all I'll say. You'll have to read the book to see what happens exactly.
Okay. I have a few questions. What would you say was the hardest part about research and writing this book? Like, what was your...
Well, surprisingly, I mean, when I started out, I wasn't sure how many women I could find who would talk to me about their clandestine lives. And the women certainly weren't reckless about doing so. They were, they were respectful of the loyalty oath that they had pledged. But the women who spoke to me, whose real names I use, and it is real names in the book, had been largely released from their their cover. So they were out from under cover. And I think the thing that surprised me and ultimately was challenging was how many women, in fact, were eager to talk about their experiences. And so I interviewed more than 100 women. And, when I started reporting the book, I was interested in this group of women who had identified the threat of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. They worked for this shadowy station in the CIA called this office called Alex Station, and it was known that it was a primarily female unit. And I was interested in that group in particular. But once I started interviewing people like Lisa Harper and Heidi August, who had such interesting post-war stories to tell, and who really helped, their experiences really helped explain why even in the 90s, women maybe weren't being listened to the way that they should. The book got bigger and longer. It became more of a thorough history of the CIA rather than a tight look at a specific group. So managing the number of people who were actually willing to talk and turning it into a historical narrative turned out to be more of a challenge than I had expected, because more women were willing to talk than I had anticipated.
Here's an interesting question. It says, how has the male-oriented CIA changed since 9/11? Has the chauvinistic atmosphere really shifted?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, and there is debate. Certainly it's shifted in that the sorts of egregious stereotypical pronouncements that you could see in my presentation, I don't think they're anything that somebody would volunteer in the course of a EEOC complaint investigation or discrimination lawsuit. There were two big discrimination lawsuits in the 1990s that did really put the CIA on notice that it needed to change its ways. And another important change that has taken place since the 1990s is it was the case for decades that gay and lesbian officers were not accepted, that to be a gay or lesbian was grounds for not being hired or losing your job in government service. And so the efforts at inclusion in that regard as well are very important. And there are, advocacy groups and support groups now within the CIA for GLBTQ serving officers, and there's much more overt conversation about that and efforts to be inclusive. So I think if you speak to women officers now, they might still complain about sort of a bro culture in overseas spy work, sometimes still running into discriminatory attitudes like, well, can a woman really operate in a place like Saudi Arabia, which is such a male-dominated culture that women can't even drive? And so women do have to prove themselves in some environments even so. But I think it's safe to say that things are a lot better and that the lessons of inclusion really have been learned. And this agency is now very proud of its history and of these female teams like Jean Vertifoy's team and like the women of Alex Station, and talks a lot about the achievement of these female teams. And of course, there's been a female CIA director, Gina Haspel. So progress has been made, even though you can still hear some concerns expressed.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question. What is the experience of people of color in the CIA today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I tried to write about that in the book. And certainly for decades and decades, it was the case that if you were a person of color and you were hired by the agency, you would often be routed into the human resources office. So it was a way in which and I don't think the CIA was alone in this. It was a way in which the agency could say, well, our numbers are good. We are hiring people of color. But then if you looked at the way in which they were being channeled, you would see that human resources, if that office was discounted, the numbers would not look nearly as good. And so people had to really fight that stereotype and fight to carve out careers. And one of the fight to carve out a career that they wanted, a career path that they wanted. And it was even harder for officers of color. And one of the recruiting hurdles that the CIA, I think, still suffers from a little bit today is in the 60s and 70s. Well, in the 70s, when it came out that the CIA had participated in the domestic surveillance of civil rights groups, and it had done domestic spying in this country, which it is forbidden to do. And the FBI as well, they were complicit in the anti-civil rights movement, in the surveillance of student groups. And that was and what remains an image problem for the CIA when it comes to recruiting officers of color. The idea that the CIA was somehow tangled up in anti-civil rights activities is something that still sorts of haunts it, as well as some of the more notorious covert actions in Africa and Central America to reverse the outcome of democratic elections.
Okay. Well, we thank you very much for taking your time.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I love libraries.
Don't we all? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Heidi.
No problem.
It's Judy. Good job. She was great, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was really good. You can tell she's done that presentation plenty, she knew it.
She did. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.